success is emergent. It's not obvious from the outset, and very often you become successful because someone gave you a chance to show that you could become successful.
When you think of startups, you think of Silicon Valley. We're going to venture beyond the valley and paint a picture of the startup ecosystem and the innovation that happens right here on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in New South Wales. We're going to feature diverse founders, investors and operators and hear about their origin stories that shaped them, highlights, lowlights, best practice and their visions for the future. Join me as we get a front seat to witness the phenomenal role of these startup superstars. This special live series of Startup Palette Show is proudly supported by Investment New South Wales. Investment New South Wales drives economic growth and prosperity for the people of New South Wales by bringing together business, government and priority markets to deliver on the government's strategic priorities and boost the state's innovation, industry, investment and trade. We would also like to thank Nakatomi, a venture studio for founders. If you have an ambitious idea that needs to be accelerated, Nakatomi are your people. They'll help you scale your business faster than you can on your own by providing you a best-in-class in-house team of strategists, designers, and engineers to help you validate, develop, and launch your bold ideas with confidence and imagination. If you have a promising pitch, reach out and say Nice 2 sent you. Let's get started. Welcome to Nice 2's Startup Palette Show Live. Welcome, Maxine. So, fun fact is, I think when I first jumped into startups in 2020 is when I got to know about you, and I was like, I heard from several people because you were part of the StartMate program, and they were all like, Maxine is fabulous, you have to meet her. And then in 2021, we finally met at a dinner, and then since then, I've been even more impressed.
Wow, I can't believe it's since 2021. Wow, that has been... I feel like I've lost time of, like, time, space continuum has completely melded.
The last several years are a bit of a blur, but I'm so glad we met.
Me too, yeah.
Let's get to know each other a little bit better. Tell me about how you grew up and how your mum was a single parent and a bit of a hippie.
Raging hippie, I think is the phrase I usually use for her. Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a couple of things in my life to date that have been really influential, and my mum and her journey and getting to watch that and be the recipient of, you know, her incredibleness has been really influential. So for context, my mum was a single mum. I have one sister. In fact, we had an all-female household for quite a while there, including the cats.
Are you older or younger?
Younger by 18 months, but we look exactly the same. So okay. I got her fake ID. She had a fake ID, and then I got her fake ID, and it still worked. So that was great. Perfect for me. So we grew up in a bunch of different places. My mum, so I was born in 1990. I don't know if you remember that era or have read about it. For my guess is for most of the people in the room, they read about it, they weren't there. But it was very multicultural, right? Like, there was an enormous amount of kind of globalization was in, the United Colours of Benetton was a thing. And so my mum was very inspired by that. And she wanted to raise 2 children who were global citizens. Downside was that she was a single mum and didn't have an external source of income. So her plan and what she did was she rotated every 3 months country to country. So she went Australia, Japan, Amsterdam / Brussels. My grandparents were living in Brussels at the time, and so she would kind of like live in Kirribilli and in my grandparents' place, and then would go to Japan and then to Brussels. And so I spoke Japanese before I spoke English. Sadly for me, when I came back to Australia, I was a gaijin in a Japanese school, which was not a very fun experience. And at 5 years old, decided that wasn't really the vibe. And so mum was like, fine, that's no worries. And then I stopped speaking Japanese and here I am. So I lived in a bunch of different places, but I watched mum be entrepreneurial to make that work. She taught English in a bunch of places. She started building companies from as early as I can remember.
What's one fun company of hers that you remember? Or any that you helped out with?
Well, interestingly, so I think like is pretty interesting. You watch your parents do things and you're like, I want to do the exact opposite of that. And so I watched her build companies. Most of them were in the like yoga, personal services space. And so she built like corporate wellness programs. She built like online directories. She was like telecommuting before telecommuting was a thing. And she actually did an incredible job of kind of using business for social impact. She would largely only employ people where there was a real impact in their life by them being employed with her. So, for example, women coming out of domestic violence situations, who hadn't been working for ages, those kinds of things. But the outcome was that not a lot of the businesses were hugely successful, or even, most of them didn't make money. So I watched that dynamic and I was like, I would like to choose the exact opposite of that thing, and I'm going to go work in one of those big buildings with a nice clear career path and become a lawyer. But it made its mark, right? She planted the seed that the way to create impact, the way to create change in the world was through entrepreneurship, was to build your own thing. And so I started like side hustling while I was at uni. I built my first company when I was at university. I actually built 2 over the course of 6 years.
Before we go there, a question about, you grew up with your mum as well as your grandparents, and those worlds were very different. Can you tell the audience a little bit about those worlds and how you handled it?
Yeah, they couldn't be more different. So for context, my grandparents, wonderful, wonderful human beings, and probably like as a combined unit were my other parent. They kind of grew up in a very different world than the one that my mum chose. So my grandma was the daughter of the US ambassador to Australia during the Menzies era, and also the kind of representative of UNICEF in Australia. I don't know for folks who are familiar with the US, but the kind of people that were doing diplomatic posts in that era came from quite snotty backgrounds.
High society.
High society. Not how she would describe it, but that's very generous. And my grandfather was the son of the then editor of the, I think it was the Sunday Times or the Sydney Morning Herald. So both of them came up in quite well-to-do environments. And so they were very clear that the rules of society had to be followed, and that, you know, there were rules that you had to play by in order to win. My grandfather went on to be the CEO of Unilever, which is a big CPG company for Europe and a bunch of other places. And so I had the kind of this version in my life that was, you know, there were rules I had to play by to eat dinner at night. There were Manly prizes. There were like ways I had to cross my legs. Otherwise, you know, I would commit a faux pas. Like all of those unwritten rules that you learn if you have to operate in that environment.
How do you use the cutlery is always the question.
Always. Oh my God. I would get in so much trouble if the fork was on the wrong side. And I was like, I feel like this is solvable. And Granny was like, it's not solvable. You know, it is not okay. And so what was really valuable was she taught me a set of rules that I don't think I would have learned anywhere else, right? And taught me that there were different codes you have to switch between to neatly fit into different environments. And that has been probably the most useful thing I have had in my life to date. If I worried about the placement of the cutlery with mum's hippie friends, it wouldn't fly. And so I got the opportunity to kind of exist between both worlds. To be honest though, if we had this conversation when I was anywhere sub 25, I would have described it to you as actually really tough, because I never felt like I fit anywhere. Yeah. I was too hippie with the posh people. I was too posh with the hippie people. Everyone else, I was just like, I don't even know how that works. You know, it took some time for me to get comfortable that actually being multilingual from a cultural perspective was really valuable.
And so is this why you decided to go down the path of starting multiple startups?
To be honest with you, that was just cash flow. I was studying full time, and I was also working in one of the law firms as a paralegal, so I started working kind of in my second year of law school. But even the combination of those two things, there was things I wanted to do that came with a bigger price tag. I wanted to go traveling with friends, etc. And I think it was like my therapist would probably say it was because you hung out with a lot of posh people who had trust funds and you were there grinding to make that work. And so I ended up building my first company as a kind of side hustle, my second company as a side hustle, actually all of them until my first venture-backed company, which wasn't until I was 26. And so everything else I had kind of built on the side to varying degrees of success.
And so did the venture-backed company come before your law career, or did it come in between?
After. But it was the thing that I did after practicing as a lawyer. So I ended up working in law firms, if you count the paralegal years, I worked there for a decade, which is in other cultures is a form of torture. But it was really valuable, extremely educational. But I got to the point in my law career, so I had obviously worked as a paralegal, then I graduated and I did the kind of classic progression in a law firm. And I got to a certain age and stage in my life where I kind of looked up and around and not a lot of people look like me, and most of them didn't think like me. And I kind of watched that group and thought about what I was doing day to day and kind of did a quick thought experiment of okay, what's my life going to look like for the next 40 years between here and there. And I didn't want to do that. So it kind of unfroze me to think about what do I want to do next? And that was my jumping off point to moving to the US. And because at that time, in 2016, there wasn't a lot of venture in Australia.
Barely existed.
Barely existed, right? I think Blackbird would have been still deploying Fund 1, Canva would have been 3 years old. God, that makes me feel really old.
Yeah.
But there just wasn't a lot around. And so venture as a concept was nowhere in my vernacular. Interestingly, entrepreneurship as a concept was nowhere in my vernacular, despite having literally been raised on the dollars of an entrepreneur. It just was nowhere in my ecosystem, whereas moving to the US, it's everywhere, or at least where I was in the US.
And so what was the difference between your side hustles and your first venture?
God, so much. So I did actually side hustle the first year and a half of my first venture-backed company because I was building it while I was studying. But like once you're full-time on it, it's just like, it's so overwhelming, especially in the Bay, like the bar you have to meet, especially because I moved to the US knowing like not a single person on the continental United States, and it's such a network-driven business. Yeah. Like the number of conversations I had to front and just be like, please love me. Like it was really like a lot of hustle. So I think there was an enormous amount of just working it out on as you go, and an enormous amount of, at the point that I was doing it full time, like we had raised pre-seed and we'd raised seed, so there's an enormous amount of kind of stakeholders in that journey at that point. So it's just a very different game.
And how did that journey go?
We scaled to just prior to Series A and found out that the business that we wanted to build wasn't going to be venture scale. So it still exists, it's called Fairshake. It's actually very similar-ish to Adjust, which just announced a big raise in Australia. And the direction Tom has taken it has been really, really excellent. But we thought we could change the landscape for legal disputes in the US, and we discovered that we could, but it wasn't going to make you venture returns. And so I stepped out from an operating role and then started an interesting journey in the kind of coaching, organizational development journey.
I'm so fascinated to hear about that, because that must give you a really unfair advantage when it comes to assessing founders.
A lot of people say this to me, like they get on the call, and for the ones that know that I've been a coach before, they're kind of expecting more of a like psychological assessment, and you're like, that's not the vibe, like that's not how this plays.
Why not?
Well, I'm not a therapist to start off with. Didn't do a psychology degree, would be extremely dangerous with a personality assessment. So I think what it did really help with though is so for context, after I started or finished my operating journey at Fairshake, I went and worked for one of my professors who I had done her course while I was at university in the US, and she was running a kind of like coaching and training program. You can imagine at Stanford University, you get like incredible access to amazing people that go on to do incredible things. And so she had essentially taught those people how to negotiate and then stayed on as their like coach, etc. So she had this training program and education framework, but she didn't build a business around it. She was also at the same time being a peace negotiator for the UN and at the same time being a prof at Stanford. So she was actually a little bit busy and didn't have a lot of time to build a business around it. And so she brought me on to build the business around her training program, which we did. And then COVID kicked off, and that was incredible for that business. And it was incredible to watch that trajectory. But what it meant was that I got to see the development journey for founders going from seed stage, having raised, a decent amount of capital and just trying to work it all out, all the way through to very successful many times over, and then like particular parts of that journey many times over. So I think the thing that I find has been most obvious to me pulling from that is that I think a lot of people approach the investing journey as if success is formulaic, meaning like you meet someone and they're like, here are all the ingredients and I'm just going to like go ahead and become a unicorn founder. So what you have to do as an investor is just like tick, 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 like ATM machine. I put in the numbers and the money comes out. That's not how that works. I wish. My biggest takeaway from that journey is that success is emergent. It's not obvious from the outset, and very often you become successful because someone gave you a chance to show that you could become successful. It is a trait that develops over time if you're wrapped in the right resources, as opposed to something that you already have and someone has to like make it possible for you. And so it's more about looking for some of those features that increase the probability that you are going to emerge through that emergent process. The rest of it is just pattern matching.
And so what led you from the highly successful coaching business to deciding you wanted to start your own fund?
So I had been angel investing along that whole journey. So I graduated from university in 2018 from my master's degree, and I started angel investing like 3 or 4 months later. For most of the people in the room, if you do the mental math on that, like I was broke. I shouldn't have been angel investing, right? But when we raised our pre-seed round, I was enormously grateful to get the backing of a guy called Dustin Dolgano and His fund is now called 43. At the time, it was called Maiden Lane. And my experience was having incredible angel investors around you and pre-seed investors around you was the difference, right? If I'm totally honest, I don't think I believed that I could build a venture-backed company until Dustin was like, I'm in. And I was like, oh, if you're in, I too am in. And so I think that really crystallized for me how valuable it is to put your voice behind someone at that very early stage with your capital. And then the second piece was that it was really hard to raise from people from underrepresented backgrounds then. We were in Trump's America in that era. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of a diversity of perspectives around the table. The Me Too movement was much more impactful in the US than it has been in Australia. And so that was the context in which we started angel investing. And then you were like, great, I'm going to step out. And then I was like, oh, I don't look like any of you guys at all. This is
awkward.
This is awkward. And so I started angel investing actually to change the demographics. Definitely not on a numbers adjusted basis, but on a just raw kind of, I'm behind you. So that was my start of angel investing.
And then some of your checks were really small to start with, right?
Itty bitty. 2,500 was my first check. And the first handful were 2,500. They only graduated to 5,000 and then 10,000 2 or 3 years later.
Moving to the fund, I think there are two things that I love about the fund. One is that it's the first round for people without the friends and family, because not all of us have a friends and family that we can lean on to raise a casual 1 million.
A cute 1 million.
A cute 1 million in 2 weeks or a week. And then the second one is that you ask founders to not just validate in Australia, but also overseas, particularly in the US.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think I could rant about this for a really long time, so feel free to knock me off the soapbox if you need to. But I just seethe at the premise of a friends and family round. Just the name at this point makes me angry. Because if you just think about the idea for a moment, right? Essentially what you're saying is that somewhere in your friends and family, there is $500 to $1 million of the riskiest capital. Current financial advice is about 8% of your assets should go to risky things. That's if you're ultra wealthy. So let's assume it's everyone else. Essentially what you're saying is all of your mates are 100 millionaires at a very minimum, and only good startups come from people that have many mates, with $100 million in net assets, which is obviously a dumb premise. Patently, obviously dumb. And so instead, if we talk about it as an asset class and you fund that first step into building, the demographic of the people building, the quality of the ideas building is so different. Part of fundraising, I'm sure many of you have experienced it who've been in startups for a while or have raised capital for your companies. Part of raising is keeping a straight face while people ask you silly things. And, and so one of the silly things that I got asked when I first started with this strategy was, do you think there's enough good ideas in Australia? And I was like, what shape do you think a funnel is? And I'll shortcut you, it's not a diamond. You don't have less ideas than you have seed stage companies. So if you accept the premise that there is interesting seed stage companies, which is not a theory anymore, it's now a fact, there has to be more ideas than there are product market fit or early product market fit traction businesses. And then when you phrase it like that, with a nice face, I obviously wasn't as sarcastic with them, they were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, it turns out that's should work to find the top of funnel. Yes, most of them. Unless I, was not very good at hiding the frustration, in which case that was not so successful.
And in terms of the validation of different markets, how does that work at an early stage?
So our filter is we need at least one Australian founder. So we work kind of across the world, and we really focused accelerating them into the US. Part of that is that premise that I mentioned before, that success is emergent, right? And in the Australian ecosystem, sadly, we just don't have the volume of resources behind founders today that they do in the US. And so it's a question of, hey, I have this really incredible seedling. Am I going to plant it in the semi-desert, or am I going to plant it in the most kind of beautifully manured garden you've ever seen? I'm probably not going to choose the desert. That's an oversimplification, but I think that the ecosystem in the US is just much stronger for certain kinds of businesses. So there's a certain degree to which I'm trying to accelerate that dynamic. What I would really love to see, and I think it's very rare, I have heard in life, to get a convergence of a couple of things. One, that where you can create, I think, quite a big impact to a group of people I deeply care about. Two, something that's really interesting to do. And three, something that if it's successful, you will make a significant amount of wealth. And the combination of those things is, if you imagine for a moment, so in 2022, Australian founders built $165 billion worth of contribution to Australia's GDP. That's 8.5% of our GDP, and that was 2022. Right? There's like 40,000 people employed in tech. Right? That is a huge contribution. So you can imagine if you grow that ecosystem astronomically, what that does for the collective wealth of Australia and the kind of life that we live and the impact that we make in the world. So if you can change the demographics that enter into venture and enter into building great companies, and those people go on and build great companies, and they build it in a way like the playbook that we're starting to see emerge, where you've got some here, like a headquarters here and a headquarters overseas, then you have incredible jobs for Australians, you have a huge contribution to GDP, and you have a lot of awesome products built. And I just see no reason why I wouldn't want to be part of that change if I can be there.
I love it. That's what we're all about as well. But it's also about the cross-cultural learnings that come.
Yeah.
There are areas like product management which aren't as sophisticated in Australia as they are in the US, for example.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet. Speaking of which, AI. How many AI pitches do you get?
I would say that the portfolio, like the group of companies that are pitching us, probably closely track to the change in YC's portfolio. So like beginning of the year, first cohort out of the gates was like 50%, or maybe the end of last year, 50%. Then their next cohort at the beginning of the year was 70, then it was 78, and now I think their latest one is like 85. I would say it's like broadly similar to that.
And so when these founders say AI, is it AI enabled or AI led?
I mean, when they say AI versus like what's actually under the hood, I think, look, thankfully most of the people pitching us are like aware of the fact that like if you use AI in your email, it does not an AI company make, So we're pretty quick for those folks to either give them that feedback if they have never got it before, or they don't propose it. So most of them is proper, what I would think of as a proper AI company, but as Annie will be talking to later, and maybe for all of us, right, that has kind of shifted. Like if you take us back 2 years, the number of people that were like, oh, rappers, we hate rappers, we think there's nothing valuable in rappers, and then like, a year later they were like, oh, turns out vertical AI is like pretty good, and like we don't have to build foundational models, and like maybe we'll leave them to build the foundations, and like, so I think it's rapidly evolving. I think we're still trying to work out what businesses are going to win in that space, and like where the formulas are, so to speak, or the things like the vectors for success. So I would say like most of the founders I speak to, if they are pitching an AI business, there is a solid amount of AI in there. The distinction I would make though is that like it's not a homogenous field, obviously. Like Gen AI and LLMs is useful for a particular thing versus very uncharitably is being called old AI. Is also very useful for a particular thing. And those businesses have been in market for a really long time. Like that technology is quite old. So we're meeting all of them because everyone who was in this category are seeing the like tailwinds of capital. And so they're starting to come out of the woodwork as well and like build the business in those spaces.
And has it caused a wave of old AI as well as Gen AI, LLM sort of businesses to explode?
I think so. I mean, there's definitely, anecdotally, yes. And the stats would say yes. I've met, to kind of like put some narrative behind that, I've met quite a few people who were like, did their masters in AI in, the 90s or even in the early 2000s, and they've then been off doing other things, and now they're filling the pool because they're like, oh, this is so interesting, I'm really excited what's going on, or I'm like, I see opportunity, etc. So I would say there's probably quite a lot of folks like reapplying those skills back.
If there's one area that you're like, oh, I just wish these companies would come to me so I could invest, what would that be?
Oof.
In AI.
I am a deep nerd for the automation of services businesses. So if you're automating a service business, I'm really interested in that space. Or you are building the picks and shovels to do that, I'm really interested. Weirdly enough, that was my thesis when I first started angel investing, because up until that point I had built like premium services businesses and worked in what is arguably the most profitable, was past tense, the most profitable premium services business in law firms. And so I'm really interested in what the delivery of a premium service or like a niche service looks like in the world of AI. Specifically, right, like you can imagine a value creation chain and where effort is being applied to create value at each stage. There are multiple parts where up until today, the most effort being applied was also the most expensive, right? Like the delivery of specialized thinking, for example, which in some circumstances, and maybe increasingly so, can start to get commodified. So it can change your value creation process, which can fundamentally change the way you produce a thing or you produce value for the customer. So if anyone's like nerd radar went up when I was talking about that, I'd really like to chat to you.
I know a few founders, so
Great.
I'll introduce them. So how much of your life do you believe you created, curated, or chanced upon?
Oh, this one's so hard. So I read this book called Blueprint, which has changed my mind about this. Essentially, like how much of our circumstances are hereditary. I still don't know if I can metabolize that, but I do think an enormous amount of my life is luck. Who I was born to, how they raised me, the country I was born in, all of these things. And I think that like doing well in life is opportunity meeting a prepared mind. And there was a period of time where I liked the thought that I couldn't be outworked, right? I love to work hard. I am a very, very happy workaholic. Really love using my mind for things and like the fulfillment that comes from pushing myself against a target and achieving an outcome. I love that environment. Since starting a fund, I've met quite a few people who can outwork me, so I can't make that claim anymore. So I would say if I had to add percentages to it, I would say of the determining factors, 90% of them are luck. But I worked really hard for that 10%.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Maxine. Thanks for tuning in to the Startup Power Show. If you had a blast listening to this episode, come on board and join our incredible cheer squad. Spread the startup love by sharing the episode with your friends, leave us a review, or drop us your valuable feedback, comments, or burning questions. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll shine the spotlight on another startup superstar. I'm Preeti Mohan, and I look forward to seeing you next time.